At 3:15 on the afternoon of December 24, 1944, Untersturmführer Fritz Langenk sat in the commander's position of his Panther tank near the Belgian village of Freynu. The 25-year-old veteran had destroyed 19 enemy tanks. He wore the Knight's Cross at his throat, awarded just 4 months earlier. His crew had repaired track damage from the previous day's fighting. The engine idled steadily despite the bitter cold. Then he saw them. 5 American Sherman tanks positioned along the muddy road leading into the village. Their hulls were visible behind a woodpile. Their commanders stood in their turrets, watching the approaches. The Shermans could not see Langenk's Panther concealed in the tree line 200 yards away. This was exactly the kind of engagement German doctrine had taught him to exploit. Superior gun. Superior armor. The element of surprise. Langenk knew what every panzer commander had learned by 1944. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank shells would bounce harmlessly off German armor. He had made this calculation dozens of times before. He knew how it would end. But what Langenk could not know as his gunner Rottenführer Paul Palm lined up the first shot, was that the simple mathematics of tank versus tank combat meant almost nothing anymore. The war had changed. The Americans had changed. And German tankers who had spent years believing in their technical superiority were about to learn a truth that would shatter everything they thought they understood about their enemy. German panzer crews did not think about American tankers the way most people assume. The reality was far more complicated, far more contradictory, and ultimately far more devastating for the Wehrmacht than simple contempt could ever have been. To understand what German tankers thought about Americans, we first need to understand what American tank crews faced when they rolled into combat against the finest armored forces in the world. Because the Germans were watching every engagement. They were analyzing every battle. And what they saw shaped opinions that would surprise most people today. The American tank crews who fought in Europe in 1943 and 1944 had no idea what their enemy thought of them. They knew only that they were climbing into machines that German guns could penetrate with terrifying ease, while their own shells often failed to stop enemy tanks. The theory behind American armor doctrine seemed sound. Medium tanks would operate in combined arms formations with infantry, artillery, and tank destroyers. The Shermans would support infantry advances and exploit breakthroughs. The tank destroyers with their more powerful guns would handle enemy armor. That was the theory. The reality was far more brutal. In Normandy during the summer of 1944, American Sherman crews discovered what it meant to face German Panthers and Tigers in the narrow lanes between tall hedgerows. The bockage terrain eliminated every advantage American doctrine relied upon. There was no room for maneuver. No space for flanking attacks. Just narrow corridors where German tanks waited in ambush with guns that could kill at ranges American tankers could not match. The statistics were horrifying. The 3rd Armored Division entered combat in Normandy with 232 Sherman tanks. During the European campaign, the division had 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat. Another 700 were knocked out, repaired, and returned to service. That represents a loss rate of 580%. Most tank crews did not survive their first encounter with German heavy armor. Those who did carried memories that haunted them for decades. Belton Cooper served as a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division throughout the war. His job required him to examine every destroyed Sherman, document the damage, and recover salvageable equipment. He saw what German guns did to American tanks and the men inside them. He wrote combat loss reports that detailed the brutal mathematics of armored warfare in 1944. Cooper later described entering destroyed Shermans to find crew members who had been literally cut to pieces by 88mm shells that passed completely through the tank, front to back, killing everyone inside before igniting the ammunition. The German 88mm gun was devastating. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, it had been adapted for use in the Tiger tank and various tank destroyers. At typical combat ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards, an 88mm round could penetrate the front armor of a Sherman and continue through the rear. The Sherman's own 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's front armor at the same distance. American tank crews understood this disparity with brutal clarity. They could do the mathematics. A direct confrontation with a tiger or panther meant almost certain death unless they could maneuver to attack from the side or rear where German armor was thinner. Consider how this affected morale. You are 20 years old. You have trained for months to crew a Sherman tank. You believe in American technology and industrial might. Then you reach Normandy and discover that your tank is outgunned, out-armored, and outmatched by enemy vehicles that can kill you from ranges where you cannot effectively fight back. The veterans who survived more than 5 missions developed a grim fatalism. They knew their survival depended more on luck than skill. They knew that sooner or later, the law of averages would catch them. What made it worse was the knowledge that American commanders continued to insist the Sherman was adequate. General Jacob Devers, commander of the armored force, declared in 1942 that the Sherman was the best tank on the battlefield. This may have been true when the Sherman first entered service in North Africa. By 1944 in northwestern Europe, it was demonstrably false. Yet the official position remained unchanged. American tankers felt betrayed by leadership that seemed unwilling to acknowledge what they faced every day. British tank crews gave the Sherman a nickname that encapsulated their fear. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised it lights first time every time. The joke was bitter. Shermans had a reputation for catching fire when penetrated. The early versions stored ammunition vertically along the inside of the hull walls. A penetrating hit would ignite the ammunition and turn the crew compartment into an inferno within seconds. Crews who survived the initial penetration had seconds to escape before the tank became a crematorium. The introduction of wet stowage in later Sherman variants helped reduce the fire risk. Ammunition was stored in liquid-filled compartments that provided some protection against ignition. But the psychological damage was done. Every tanker who climbed into a Sherman knew the statistics. They had heard the stories. They had seen the burned hulks. And they went into combat anyway because that was their job. German panzer crews noticed this. They could not help but notice it. What kind of soldiers kept fighting in machines they knew were inferior? What kind of courage did that require? The German tankers who faced American Shermans in 1943 and early 1944 were among the most experienced armored soldiers in the world. Many had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. They had participated in the Great Encirclement battles of 1941 that destroyed Soviet armies. They had learned their trade against the British in North Africa where Erwin Rommel had established German tactical superiority through aggressive maneuver. These were not conscripts. These were professionals who understood armored warfare at a level American crews were still trying to match. The greatest German tank commanders had accumulated victory counts that seemed impossible. Kurt Nispel, Otto Karius, Michael Wittmann. These men and others like them had destroyed dozens or even hundreds of enemy tanks. Their experience gave them tactical instincts that newer crews lacked. They knew how to read terrain. They knew when to advance and when to wait. They knew exactly where to aim to achieve a catastrophic kill with the first shot. This expertise made them extremely dangerous opponents. But expertise alone does not win wars. The Germans were discovering this truth with increasing clarity as 1944 progressed. American industrial capacity was overwhelming. No matter how many Shermans German tankers destroyed, more appeared. The production numbers told a story that German strategic planners found deeply troubling. The United States produced approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war. Germany produced roughly 6,000 Panther tanks and fewer than 1,500 Tigers. The quantitative disparity was staggering. German tankers began encountering American Shermans in North Africa in late 1942. Intelligence reports from 5th Panzer Army noted with interest the appearance of a new American medium tank designated M4. The reports acknowledged that this Sherman tank was roughly comparable to the German Panzer IV, the standard medium tank of the Wehrmacht. Initial assessments were cautious but not dismissive. The Sherman had good mobility. Its reliability was noted as exceptional. But German officers believed their crew's superior training and experience would compensate for any technical parity. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. In Tunisia, experienced German crews routinely outfought American units that were new to combat. German doctrine emphasized aggressive action and combined arms coordination. American units were still learning how to fight in an environment where German tactical excellence could exploit every mistake. The early battles in North Africa taught American tankers hard lessons about what it meant to face the Wehrmacht. But the Germans also learned something from these engagements. The Americans would not quit. They absorbed losses. They adapted. They kept coming back. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the situation had evolved dramatically. The Sherman was now facing second-generation German tanks that were vastly superior in firepower and armor protection. The Panther weighed 4 to 5 tons, mounted a 75 mm high-velocity gun that could penetrate a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, and featured sloped frontal armor that was nearly impervious to the Sherman's gun. The Tiger weighed 56 tons, carried the legendary 88 mm gun, and was protected by armor up to 4 inches thick. These were formidable weapons that represented the pinnacle of German tank design. Yet German tankers discovered something unexpected in the battles of 1944. The Americans were getting better. Much better. The crews arriving in France after D-Day had received far more training than the men who fought in North Africa. They understood their tanks. They knew their limitations. And they were learning to fight in ways that exploited American advantages while minimizing exposure to German strengths. German after-action reports began noting a disturbing trend. American tank crews were becoming increasingly skilled at combined arms tactics. They coordinated closely with infantry. They used artillery effectively. They employed white phosphorus shells in ways German commanders found deeply unnerving. The white phosphorus tactic deserves special attention because it reveals how American crews adapted to fighting technically superior opponents. White phosphorus shells were originally intended as artillery markers. Tank crews discovered that when these shells struck a German tank, the burning phosphorus would adhere to the armor and create acrid smoke that was sucked into the crew compartment through the ventilation system. The smoke was toxic. The heat was intense. German crews could not see through their optics. They could not breathe. Faced with the choice between remaining in their disabled tank and abandoning it, many German tankers chose to bail out even when their vehicle was still mechanically functional. This was psychological warfare using a weapon that exploited the very sophistication of German tank design. German prisoners interrogated in March 1945 provided assessments that revealed their evolving perspective on American armor. 22 captured fighter pilots and tankers were asked to evaluate American equipment and tactics. Their responses were revealing. They acknowledged that the Sherman was not the equal of a Panther or Tiger in direct combat. But they noted that American tanks operated in overwhelming numbers with excellent logistical support. They recognized that American crews were aggressive and well-coordinated. One captured tanker who had served for 8 years, including the pre-war period, stated that the weapons German tank crews feared most were not other tanks but American tank destroyers and bazookas. The M-36 Jackson tank destroyer, with its 90 mm gun, could penetrate any German armor. Infantry armed with bazookas could disable tanks by hitting tracks, destroying optics, or setting engines afire with well-placed shots. This represents a crucial shift in German thinking. By 1945, experienced German tankers had stopped viewing American armor as primarily a technical problem. They saw it as part of a comprehensive system that combined adequate equipment with superior numbers, excellent logistics, overwhelming air power, and determined crews who refused to quit despite losses. This systemic advantage was something German tactical excellence could not overcome. The finest panzer commanders in the world could not compensate for fuel shortages, spare parts shortages, and the constant attrition of experienced crews. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 crystallized these contradictions. Hitler's last great offensive in the West assembled the most powerful concentration of German armor since 1943. More than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks struck through the Ardennes forest in an attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. American units holding the Ardennes sector were rest and refit formations. They were thinly spread. They were not prepared for a major attack. For the first 2 days, the German advance seemed unstoppable. But then something happened that German planners had not fully anticipated. The American response was neither panic nor retreat. It was stubborn, determined resistance at critical road junctions. at Elsenborn Ridge, at St. Vith, at Bastogne. Small groups of American soldiers and tankers held positions that should have been overrun. They fought with a tenacity that surprised their opponents. German commanders who had expected American lines to collapse found instead that every crossroads became a battle. Every village required assault. Every mile forward was purchased with casualties the Wehrmacht could not afford. At Krinkelt and Rochrath, American Sherman crews from the 741st Tank Battalion fought alongside infantry and tank destroyers against the 12th SS Panzer Division. The fighting was brutal. German Panthers and Panzer IVs attacked through the fog and snow. American bazookas teams engaged at point-blank range. By the end of the engagement, 48 German armored vehicles had been destroyed. 21 by bazooka teams, 27 by guns, anti-tank weapons, and mines. The German offensive was delayed for crucial hours that allowed reinforcements to reach the threatened sector. This pattern repeated across the Bulge. German technical superiority in individual tank versus tank combat could not compensate for American advantages in combined arms coordination, artillery support, and sheer determination. German panzer crews found themselves fighting not just against Shermans but against an integrated military system that exploited every German weakness. When the weather cleared and American air power returned, German columns were devastated by rocket-firing fighter bombers that hunted across the Ardennes. Tanks that survived American ground forces were destroyed from the air by P-47s firing rockets into their thin top armor. Untersturmführer Langeank understood none of this as his gunner Palm took aim at the American Shermans near Freyneau on Christmas Eve. He understood only what 1943 had taught him. Panthers were superior to Shermans. German crews were better trained. The Americans would break when faced with overwhelming firepower. These beliefs had been true once. But the war had moved beyond such simple calculations. Langeank's Panther advanced. Palm fired. The first shot struck a Sherman in its gun barrel, wounding the tank commander and sending the crew scrambling from their vehicle. Within seconds, 3 more Shermans were burning. The 5th withdrew over the hill. It looked like a German victory. But victory in 1944 was not measured in destroyed Shermans. It was measured in whether the mission succeeded. And Langeank's mission was to clear Freyneau of American troops so German units could advance. The Americans held Freyneau. They would continue holding it. And while Langeank's crew celebrated their kills, American reinforcements were moving into position. American artillery was registering targets. American tank destroyers were maneuvering to engage. The Germans had won the engagement but were losing the battle and had already lost the war. They simply did not know it yet. The transformation in German thinking about American tank crews happened gradually through 1944, then suddenly in 1945. It was not a single moment of revelation but an accumulation of encounters that forced German tankers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans they had dismissed in Tunisia, the crews they had destroyed so easily in Normandy, had evolved into something dangerous. Something that could not be stopped. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was collapsing. Hitler's gamble to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp had failed. German panzer divisions that had rolled forward with confidence in mid-December were now fighting desperate rearguard actions. The fuel shortage that had plagued German operations from the beginning became catastrophic. Tanks were abandoned because they had no gasoline. Others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The 6th SS Panzer Army, once the spearhead of the offensive, withdrew from the Ardennes on January 22. The 5th Panzer Army inherited its sector and tried to hold the line. It could not. The psychological impact on German tankers was profound. They had been told this offensive would turn the tide of the war. They had been promised fuel and ammunition would be available. They had been assured that American forces were weak and disorganized. All of these promises proved false. American resistance at key crossroads like St. Vith and Bastogne had delayed the German advance by crucial days. When the weather cleared and Allied fighter bombers returned to the sky, German columns were devastated. Tanks that survived American ground forces were destroyed from the air by P-47s firing rockets into their thin top armor. General Oberst Joseph Horp commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the final stages of the Bulge. He was an experienced officer who had fought in Poland, France, and extensively on the Eastern Front. By April 1945, Horp was commanding what remained of German forces trapped in the Ruhr Pocket. On April 17, paratroopers from the American 17th Airborne Division captured him as he attempted to cross the Rhine to reach German units still operating in the Netherlands. His capture symbolized the complete collapse of German armored forces in the West. The panzer armies that had once seemed invincible were finished. The Ruhr Pocket encirclement was the final demonstration of American combined arms superiority. On April 1, 1945, lead elements of the American 1st Army and 9th Army met east of the Ruhr, trapping over 317,000 German troops. Feldmarschall Walter Model commanded Army Group B, surrounded and cut off inside the pocket. His forces included remnants of 19 divisions, but only about 75,000 of his men had infantry weapons. Another 75,000 had only pistols. Ammunition was critically low. Fuel was nearly exhausted. American forces spent 2 weeks methodically reducing the pocket. On April 14, the 1st and 9th Armies linked up again, splitting the German pocket in half. German resistance began to crumble immediately. Model refused to surrender. When American General Matthew Ridgway sent an aide under a white flag requesting his capitulation, Model cited his oath to Hitler and declined. But he recognized the war was over. On April 15, Model dissolved Army Group B. He ordered Volkssturm militia and non-combatant personnel to discard their uniforms and go home. He told his remaining combat troops that their fight was finished. When a squad leader of a still-armed German unit asked for instructions, Model shook their hands, wished them luck, and told them to return to their families. Then he attempted to escape through American lines with a small column. He could not make it through. On April 21, unwilling to surrender with the rank of Field Marshal, Walter Model committed suicide. The Wehrmacht lost over 300,000 soldiers captured in the Ruhr Pocket alone. It was the largest mass surrender in German history. German tankers who survived to see the final days of the war carried memories of a complete reversal. In 1943, they had been confident. Their training was superior. Their tactics were proven. Their commanders were experienced. The Americans were new to war, untested, soft. By 1945, everything had changed. The Americans were everywhere. Their numbers seemed infinite. Their coordination was flawless. Their air support was overwhelming. German tankers who had once sought combat now tried desperately to avoid it. Every engagement could be their last. The confidence that had characterized the Panzer forces in their glory days had evaporated completely. The 11th Panzer Division, known as the Gespenster Division or Ghost Division, surrendered to American forces near the Czech-German border in early May 1945. General Major Freiherr Edgar von Butlar commanded the division. But the real power behind the surrender negotiations was Generalleutnant Wendt von Wietersheim, the former division commander who had been officially relieved of command 2 weeks earlier but remained close to division headquarters as a consultant. Von Wietersheim was a pragmatist. He had been ordered to Berlin to assume command of a paper organization, the 51st Panzer Corps, to participate in the final defense of the German capital. He reported himself sick and unable to assume the position. He had no desire to die in Berlin for a cause that was already lost. When elements of the American 2nd Cavalry Group entered the Czech town of Hostun in late April, they came into contact with forward elements of the 11th Panzer Division. Fighting broke out. But Colonel Charles Reed, commanding the American cavalry, quickly realized the Germans were more interested in surrendering to Americans than fighting them. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east. German tankers understood what Soviet captivity meant. They desperately wanted to surrender to the Americans instead. Reed facilitated negotiations. On May 4, at 4 in the afternoon, Generalleutnant von Wietersheim met with American Brigadier General Herbert Ernest to formalize the surrender. The meeting was cordial. Ernest asked if the Germans had enough fuel to drive their vehicles to designated assembly areas. Von Wietersheim replied with a sad smile that some vehicles would soon run out of gasoline. Ernest said the men would have to walk. Von Wietersheim responded that his soldiers were used to hauling each other's vehicles. They had been doing it for months as the fuel situation deteriorated. What happened next reveals something important about how German tankers viewed the Americans by war's end. The 11th Panzer Division was integrated into occupation duties alongside American forces. Some German tank crews and mechanics worked with the American 2nd Constabulary Regiment. When the regiment participated in a major parade for General Dwight Eisenhower, roughly half the troops mounted on horseback, most of the musicians, and portions of the vehicle crews were veterans of the demobilized German 11th Panzer Division. Eisenhower did not know this, but it demonstrated that some level of practical cooperation had replaced the absolute hostility that characterized earlier years. These German tankers were working alongside the Americans they had fought against weeks earlier. This cooperation was not universal. The experience of surrender varied dramatically depending on where and when it occurred. An American soldier named George Jaeger, born in Vienna and serving as an interpreter, encountered an entire SS Panzer Division attempting to surrender in early May 1945. Jaeger was riding a bicycle through the Bavarian countryside when he came around a bend and found himself staring directly into the cannon of an SS tank at 20 yards. Behind it stretched an endless column of tanks with SS standards flying. Their crews sat on the turrets, staring at him in silence. Jaeger later described the moment as absurd. What do you do on a bicycle when facing an SS Panzer Division? If he reached for his weapon, he would be killed instantly. If he kept pedaling, at least he would not be shot in the back. An SS officer ran toward him. Jaeger thought this was the end, but the officer simply signaled him to stop, then stepped aside. The SS division's commanding general, wearing his leather jacket, stood between two tanks surrounded by his officers. He explained politely in German that they had retreated before Soviet forces and had been hiding for several days looking for a safe way to surrender to the Americans. Jaeger's arrival was most fortunate. Would he accept the division's surrender on behalf of the United States? Jaeger, recently promoted to private first class, tried to look dignified under these historic circumstances. He said he would be glad to accept the surrender but needed the general's Luger pistol as a token to take to his superiors. The general simply handed it over. They shook hands and saluted. Jaeger got back on his bicycle and pedaled away, waving to his prisoners of war with new confidence. When Jaeger returned to 5th Corps headquarters and reported that he had accepted the surrender of an SS Panzer Division, his sergeant nearly put him on kitchen patrol for a week. Even when he talked his way up the chain of command, a major on duty was certain there were no stray Panzer divisions in the area. Finally, Jaeger spoke to the colonel in charge of intelligence, who said they had been looking for this division and could not find it. A second, more official surrender was arranged. Jaeger was not invited. The story illustrates how desperate German tankers had become by May 1945. An entire SS Panzer Division preferred to surrender to a lone American soldier on a bicycle rather than risk fighting or falling into Soviet hands. Otto Karius was one of Germany's most successful tank commanders. He destroyed over 150 enemy tanks and was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. After the war, Karius wrote a memoir titled Tigers in the Mud that provided insight into how German tankers viewed their opponents. Karius acknowledged that American tank crews improved dramatically as the war progressed. He noted their aggressive tactics, their excellent coordination with infantry and artillery, and their overwhelming numerical advantage. He admitted that by late 1944, German tankers faced enemies who were skilled, determined, and supported by resources Germany could not match. Karius survived the war and lived until 2015. In his later years, he spoke about his wartime experiences without hatred for his former enemies. He recognized that both sides had been soldiers doing their duty under terrible circumstances. Michael Wittmann was perhaps the most famous German tank commander of the war. He was credited with destroying 138 enemy tanks and 132 anti-tank guns. Wittmann achieved his greatest victory at Villers-Bocage in Normandy on June 13, 1944, when his single Tiger tank destroyed portions of a British armored column and halted an advance that threatened German positions. But Wittmann's success against British forces in Normandy did not translate to invincibility against American forces as the campaign progressed. On August 8, 1944, Wittmann was killed when his Tiger was hit during Operation Totalize, the Canadian offensive south of Ardennes. Whether he was destroyed by a Canadian Sherman Firefly, a British anti-tank gun, or rocket-firing Typhoon fighters remains disputed. What matters is that even the greatest German tank ace could not survive the overwhelming firepower the Allies could concentrate against individual targets. The accounts of German tankers after the war reveal a consistent pattern. They acknowledged American courage. They recognized American determination. They admitted that American industrial capacity was decisive. But they rarely expressed contempt. Even in defeat, German veterans spoke of American tank crews with a grudging respect that acknowledged what those crews had overcome. The men who climbed into Shermans knowing they were outgunned and out-armored demonstrated a form of courage that German tankers understood. It was not the courage of technical superiority. It was the courage of accepting terrible odds and fighting anyway. Lafayette Poole was one of the most successful American tank commanders. The Army did not officially recognize tank aces, but the magazine Yank described Poole in March 1945 as the ace of American tankers. Poole commanded a Sherman named in the Mood that destroyed approximately 12 German tanks and numerous other vehicles before being knocked out in Belgium. Poole survived that engagement and received another Sherman. By the time he was seriously wounded in September 1944, Poole's crews had destroyed over 250 enemy vehicles including tanks, armored cars, and self-propelled guns. Poole's success came not from superior equipment but from superior tactics, aggressive leadership, and the determination to close with the enemy regardless of risk. Creighton Abrams commanded a Sherman tank in the 4th Armored Division throughout the European campaign. He participated in the relief of Bastogne and numerous other engagements. After the war, Abrams credited his gunner for their success. This humility characterized many American tank commanders who understood that crew coordination mattered more than individual heroics. Abrams later rose to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army during the Vietnam War. The American M1 Abrams tank, introduced in 1980, was named in his honor. German tankers who faced men like Poole and Abrams discovered that American crews could match German skill when given adequate equipment and support. The introduction of the M26 Pershing heavy tank in February 1945 gave American crews a vehicle that could finally fight German Tigers and Panthers on equal terms. The Pershing mounted a 90mm gun that could penetrate German heavy armor at combat ranges. It featured thicker armor that provided better protection. Only a few hundred Pershings reached Europe before the war ended, but their presence had psychological impact. German tankers who had grown accustomed to technical superiority suddenly faced an opponent that matched their capabilities. Combined with the M36 Jackson tank destroyer, which also mounted a 90mm gun, American forces finally possessed weapons that could destroy any German tank they encountered. But even without the Pershing, American tank crews had adapted their tactics to compensate for the Sherman's limitations. They learned to use terrain for cover. They coordinated closely with tank destroyers and infantry equipped with bazookas. They called in artillery and air support. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. They exploited their advantages in mobility and reliability. German tankers discovered that fighting American forces was not about winning individual tank duels. It was about surviving a comprehensive system that attacked from every angle with resources that seemed limitless. The white phosphorus tactic deserves special mention because it reveals how American ingenuity compensated for technical deficiencies. German tanks featured sophisticated ventilation systems that provided fresh air to the crew. When a white phosphorus shell struck a Panther or Tiger, burning phosphorus adhered to the armor and created toxic smoke that was sucked into the crew compartment. The smoke was blinding. The heat was intense. German crews could not breathe. Faced with suffocation inside their tank, many crews abandoned vehicles that were still mechanically operational. American tank crews discovered they could neutralize German technical superiority by exploiting the very sophistication of German design. This psychological warfare was devastating. When German prisoners were interrogated in March 1945, they provided honest assessments of what they had faced. Captured tankers acknowledged that American crews were dangerous opponents. They noted American coordination with infantry. They feared American artillery support. They dreaded American air power. One captured tanker with 8 years of service stated that the weapons German tank crews feared most were not other tanks but American tank destroyers and bazookas. The M36 Jackson with its 90mm gun could penetrate any German armor. Infantry armed with bazookas could disable tanks by destroying tracks, optics, or engines with well-placed shots to vulnerable areas. This represents the final evolution in German thinking. By 1945, experienced German tankers no longer viewed American armor primarily as a technical problem. They understood they were fighting a comprehensive military system that combined adequate equipment with overwhelming numbers, excellent logistics, devastating air power, and determined crews. This systemic advantage was something individual German tactical excellence could not overcome. The finest panzer commanders in the world could not compensate for fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, spare parts shortages, and the constant attrition of experienced crews who could not be replaced. The statistics tell the story of this transformation. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and fewer than 1,500 Tigers during the entire war. The United States produced approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks. The quantitative disparity was staggering. But numbers alone do not explain the outcome. German tanks often had superior armor and firepower. What decided the armored battles of 1944 and 1945 was not individual tank quality. It was the ability to sustain operations. It was logistics. It was training. It was the rotation of experienced crews who could teach new soldiers how to survive. These were areas where American advantages proved decisive. German tank training had deteriorated catastrophically by 1945. Fuel shortages meant new drivers received minimal practice. Some panzer crews arrived at the front with less than 20 hours of driving time in their assigned vehicles. They did not know how to perform basic maintenance. They could not coordinate with infantry. They lacked the tactical instincts that kept veterans alive. American crews, by contrast, received hundreds of hours of training. They practiced gunnery until they could hit targets consistently. They learned formation driving. They studied combined arms tactics. When American tank crews reached the front in 1945, they were prepared for combat in ways German replacement crews were not. The German fly until you die policy meant that experienced tankers stayed in combat until they were killed or so badly wounded they could not continue. When these veterans died, their knowledge died with them. There was no systematic effort to rotate skilled commanders to training duties where they could create more skilled commanders. American practice was different. After completing their combat tours, experienced tank commanders often returned to the United States to train new crews. One veteran who survived could help create dozens of competent tankers. The American system preserved expertise and spread knowledge across the entire force. German aces kept fighting until they were killed. American veterans went home and created more veterans. By April 1945, the strategic situation was hopeless for Germany. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin. American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing deep into Germany. German tank production continued, but there was no fuel to operate the vehicles. New Panthers and Tigers sat abandoned on factory lots without gasoline to move them to assembly areas. The training schools had closed. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed. The industrial base was collapsing under relentless bombing. The war was over. All that remained was the final surrender. What did German tank crews really think about American tankers in World War II? The answer evolved dramatically from 1943 to 1945. In North Africa and early in Normandy, many German tankers viewed Americans with confidence bordering on contempt. The Sherman was inferior to German medium tanks. American crews were inexperienced. German tactical doctrine was proven through years of successful campaigns. These early assessments were not entirely wrong. American tank crews in Tunisia and Normandy suffered terrible casualties against experienced German opponents fighting from superior positions with better equipment. But German tankers noticed something important even in these early defeats. The Americans did not quit. They absorbed losses that would have broken other armies. They adapted their tactics. They improved their coordination. They kept coming back. German after-action reports began noting a disturbing trend. American tank crews were getting better. They operated in overwhelming numbers with excellent logistical support. They coordinated closely with infantry, artillery, and air power. They used innovative tactics like white phosphorus shells that exploited German technical advantages against German crews. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German tankers understood they were facing a formidable enemy. The Americans, who had struggled in Normandy 6 months earlier, now fought with confidence and skill. They held critical road junctions against overwhelming attacks. They absorbed German breakthroughs and counterattacked. They refused to panic when surrounded. The stubborn American defense at Bastogne symbolized this transformation. When German commanders demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. His troops held the crossroads until relief arrived. German panzer divisions that should have swept past American positions found themselves delayed, then stopped, then pushed back. By January and February 1945, the psychological transformation was complete. German tankers were no longer hunters. They were prey. Every mission could be their last. American forces were everywhere. American tank destroyers with 90mm guns could kill Panthers and Tigers at range. American fighter bombers armed with rockets destroyed German columns from the air. American artillery was devastatingly accurate and responded within minutes to calls for support. German tankers who had once felt invincible now fought with grim fatalism. They knew they could not win. They hoped only to survive. The final surrenders in April and May 1945 revealed the complete collapse of German morale. Entire panzer divisions surrendered to handfuls of American soldiers. SS units that had fought fanatically months earlier now begged to be taken prisoner by Americans rather than Soviets. The confidence that had characterized German armored forces in their glory days had vanished completely. What remained was exhaustion, resignation, and the desire to survive a war that was already lost. After the war, German tank veterans spoke about their American opponents with complex emotions. They acknowledged American courage. They recognized American determination. They admitted that American industrial capacity was overwhelming. But they rarely spoke with hatred. Men like Otto Carius and others who survived wrote memoirs that treated American tankers as worthy opponents who had earned respect through their performance under fire. The Americans who climbed into Shermans knowing the odds, knowing they might die, demonstrated a form of courage that German veterans understood and acknowledged. Some German veterans became friends with their former enemies. They attended reunions together. They shared stories. They recognized that both sides had been soldiers doing impossible jobs under terrible circumstances. These relationships did not erase the killing. They did not minimize the suffering. But they demonstrated that even enemies can recognize shared humanity when the fighting finally stops. The bonds formed through combat sometimes outlasted the conflict itself. What German tank crews thought about American tankers was ultimately this: they thought the Americans were brave. This was undeniable from the beginning. Men who fought in machines they knew were inferior against opponents who could kill them at range demonstrated extraordinary courage. They thought the Americans were determined. No matter how many Shermans were destroyed, more appeared. No matter how many casualties were inflicted, American forces kept attacking. The production capacity was staggering. The replacement system worked. The Americans would not quit. They thought the Americans were increasingly skilled. Crews who struggled in North Africa and Normandy evolved into dangerous opponents by late 1944. Their tactics improved. Their coordination was excellent. They exploited every German weakness with ruthless efficiency. They thought the Americans were overwhelmingly powerful. Not individually but systematically. American tank crews operated within a military structure that provided devastating artillery support, overwhelming air power, excellent logistics, and reliable equipment. This comprehensive superiority was something German tactical excellence could not overcome. And some of them at least thought the Americans were fellow soldiers. Men doing a difficult job under terrible conditions. Not monsters. Not machines. Human beings who had been ordered to fight and did so with as much courage as anyone could ask. When the war ended, these German veterans carried memories of opponents who had earned their respect through performance on the battlefield. The recognition did not undo the killing. It did not change the outcome. But it acknowledged that both sides had fought with courage and both sides had paid terrible prices. The American tank crews who fought in Europe faced technical disadvantages throughout most of the war. The Sherman was outgunned by Panthers and Tigers. It was more vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Crews knew that every engagement could be their last. Yet they climbed into their tanks each morning and did their jobs. They supported infantry attacks. They exploited breakthroughs. They hunted German tanks despite being outmatched. They absorbed casualties that represented a loss rate exceeding 500% in some divisions and continued fighting. This was not the performance of soft soldiers or untested amateurs. This was the performance of warriors who refused to break regardless of odds. German tank crews recognized this. Even in victory, even when destroying American Shermans with relative ease, they could not dismiss the courage it required for American crews to keep fighting. Even in defeat, when German panzer forces collapsed under overwhelming pressure, German veterans acknowledged that their opponents had earned their success through determination and sacrifice. The American tank crews had started the war at a disadvantage. They had absorbed terrible losses. They had learned from their mistakes. And they had won. That is what German tank crews really thought about American tankers in World War II. The opinions evolved from confidence to concern to respect to fear to grudging acknowledgement. The transformation was shaped by experience, by the relentless pressure of American industrial might, by the improvement in American tactics, and by the recognition that courage exists on both sides of any conflict. German tank veterans who survived carried these memories for the rest of their lives. Some spoke openly about what they had witnessed. Others kept their thoughts private. But the consensus among those who fought was clear. The Americans who crewed those Shermans were not the soft enemy propaganda had promised. They were dangerous opponents who had earned respect through their willingness to fight and die. When we remember the armored battles of World War II, we should remember this. The statistics matter. The technical specifications are important. The strategies and tactics deserve study. But wars are fought by people. The men who climbed into Shermans and Panthers and Tigers were not statistics. They were human beings making impossible choices under terrible pressure. Some chose mercy when killing would have been easier. Some chose to keep fighting when surrender would have been simpler. All of them lived with the consequences of their choices. The German tank crews who fought against Americans learned something that propaganda could not teach. Their enemies were not weak. They were not cowards. They were soldiers who matched German determination with American resourcefulness. They compensated for technical disadvantages with numerical advantages and superior logistics. They turned courage and industrial might into victory. And in the end, that victory was earned through the sacrifice of thousands of American tank crews who knew the odds and fought anyway. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video. It helps us preserve forgotten perspectives from the Second World War. Subscribe to discover more untold histories that deserve to be remembered. Every story matters. Every sacrifice demands acknowledgement. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, connecting veterans, historians, and anyone who believes these stories must never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. The men who fought deserve nothing less than our solemn commitment to remember what they endured and what they achieved. Their courage, on both sides of the conflict, reminds us that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can prevail.